The American Civil War killed more soldiers than every other American war combined. It destroyed an entire way of life and freed 4 million people. But here's the strangest part. The war started in one man's front yard and ended 4 years later in his living room. Same man. Yeah, seriously. His name was Wilmer McLean, and he spent the whole war running away from it. And the war chased him 120 miles to finish in his parlor. So how does a country end up tearing itself in half? A general gave away an entire city as a Christmas present. A copy of the enemy's secret battle plan was found wrapped around 3 cigars. And the bloodiest single day in American history happened over a cornfield. So how did that even happen? Here's a map of the United States in 1860. The country was split into 2 halves that barely felt like the same nation. Up here in the north, you had factories, railroads, cities, and a population growing fast with immigrants. Down here in the south, you had a farming economy built on one thing: cotton. And that cotton was picked by nearly 4 million enslaved people. The North and the South had argued about slavery for decades, but every time the fight got dangerous, they patched it with a deal. As America grew westward, the real question became simple and explosive. Would the new states out here be free or slave? Every new state tipped the balance of power in Congress, so neither side would back down. Then, in November 1860, Abraham Lincoln won the presidency without a single Southern electoral vote. Lincoln didn't promise to abolish slavery where it already existed, but he wanted to stop it from spreading. And to the South, that was the beginning of the end. Hey, the North is trying to choke us out. If we can't expand, we're finished. Then we leave. We don't need them. You really think you can just walk out of the United States? Watch us. South Carolina walked first, in December 1860. Then Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. 7 states formed a brand new country, the Confederate States of America, and picked Jefferson Davis as their president. The Union was now a room full of dry timber soaked in gasoline, and both sides were holding matches. All it needed was one spark. The spark came at a small island fort in Charleston Harbor called Fort Sumter, right here in South Carolina. It was a federal fort sitting inside Confederate territory, and the Union soldiers inside refused to leave. President Lincoln faced an impossible choice: pull the soldiers out and admit the Confederacy was real, or send supplies and risk the first shot of a war. He chose to send food, not weapons, and dared the South to fire. They took the dare. On April 12, 1861, Confederate cannons opened fire and bombarded the fort for 34 straight hours. Strangely, not one man was killed in the battle itself, but it didn't matter. The shot had been fired, and now everything snapped into motion. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion, and that demand backfired instantly. 4 more states, including Virginia, the most powerful state in the South, refused to fight against their neighbors and joined the Confederacy. Now there were 11 Confederate states, and the capital moved to Richmond, Virginia, just 100 miles from Washington. Both sides thought it would be a quick, glorious war over in 90 days, that one big battle would settle the whole thing. They were about to find out how wrong they were. The first real battle came in July 1861, near a creek called Bull Run, right here in Virginia. It was so close to Washington that crowds of civilians packed picnic baskets and rode out in carriages to watch the show, expecting a fun afternoon out. Instead, the Union Army got routed and came stampeding back toward the Capitol, tangled up with the terrified spectators in a giant traffic jam of panic. And that very first battle was fought on the farm of a man named Wilmer McLean. A cannonball came crashing right through his kitchen while a Confederate general was eating dinner inside. McLean took one look at his wrecked home and said, "That's it, we're leaving." He packed up his family and moved 120 miles south to a sleepy little village where surely no army would ever bother him. Remember that. Now both sides got serious, and the strategy took shape. The North came up with something called the Anaconda plan. The idea was to squeeze the South to death like a giant snake. First, blockade every southern port with the Navy so no cotton could get out and no guns could get in. Second, take control of the Mississippi River right here to cut the Confederacy in half. And third, eventually crush the Southern armies. It was slow, unglamorous, and newspapers mocked it. but it would end up working exactly as designed. The problem was the South had something the North didn't: better generals, at least at the start. And the best of them all was a man named Robert E. Lee. Lincoln had actually offered Lee command of the entire Union Army. Lee turned it down because he couldn't bring himself to fight against Virginia, his home. So he led the South instead, and for 2 years he made the Union pay. Now it's 1862, and the war turned into a slaughterhouse. Out west, a quiet, stubborn Union general was making a name for himself. His name was Ulysses S. Grant. At a place called Shiloh in Tennessee, Grant won a brutal victory, but the cost was staggering. In just 2 days, there were more than 23,000 casualties, more than every previous American war combined, in a single battle. America had never seen anything like it, and the killing was just getting started. Here was the deadly problem. The weapons had gotten far deadlier, but the tactics hadn't caught up. For centuries, armies marched shoulder to shoulder in tight lines because the old muskets could only hit a target close up. But the new rifles could now kill a man from hundreds of yards away. Generals kept marching men in those same neat lines straight into that fire, and the result was carnage on a scale nobody had imagined. And then came the bloodiest day of all. In September 1862, Lee gambled. He pushed his army north into Maryland, into Union territory, hoping a big victory on northern soil would convince Britain and France to back the South. But a Union soldier stumbled onto the most incredible piece of luck in the entire war: a copy of Lee's secret battle plans, dropped in a field, wrapped around 3 cigars. Suddenly, the Union knew exactly where Lee's army was split and vulnerable. The two armies collided near a creek called Antietam. On September 17, 1862, in a single cornfield that changed hands over and over, the fighting was so intense that the tall corn was cut down as if by a scythe, with bodies falling in rows. By nightfall, roughly 23,000 men were dead, wounded, or missing. It remains the bloodiest single day in American history, before or since. Antietam was a draw on the battlefield, but it handed Lincoln something he'd been waiting for. 5 days later, he announced the Emancipation Proclamation. Starting January 1st, 1863, all enslaved people in the rebelling states were declared free. Now, this was a masterstroke. It didn't free everyone overnight, but it completely changed what the war was about. It was no longer just a fight to save the Union. It was now a war to end slavery. And that one move killed the South's last hope of foreign help. Britain and France had been considering recognizing the Confederacy, but neither one could stomach openly siding with slavery now. The South was on its own, and black men poured into the Union Army. By the end of the war, around 180,000 of them would fight for their own freedom in their own country. Now let's step off the battlefield for a second, because the truth is, most soldiers didn't die in glorious charges. They died in camp. For every man killed by a bullet, roughly 2 died of sickness: dysentery, typhoid, measles, ripping through camps of men who'd grown up isolated on farms with no immunity. Their diet was a rock-hard biscuit called hardtack, so tough they soaked it in coffee just to crack it, and often crawling with weevils. And if you were captured, things got even worse. At the Confederate prison camp of Andersonville in Georgia, 45,000 Union prisoners were crammed into a space built for a fraction of that. Their only water, a creek that also served as the toilet. During the worst summer months, over 100 men died every single day. Nearly 13,000 died there in all. This was the real face of the war. Now it's 1863, and this is the year everything turned. In the East, Lee was still winning. At Chancellorsville, he pulled off his greatest victory, beating a Union army twice his size. But it cost him his best general, Stonewall Jackson, accidentally shot by his own men in the dark. Lee decided to gamble again and invade the North a second time. This time, the armies smashed into each other at a small Pennsylvania town called Gettysburg. For 3 days in July, it became the biggest battle ever fought in North America. 51,000 casualties. On the final day, Lee made the fatal decision. He ordered 12,500 men to march straight across a mile of open ground, uphill, into the center of the Union line and its waiting cannons. It's called Pickett's Charge. They got cut to pieces, and barely half came back. Lee's invasion was broken, and he limped back to Virginia. He would never threaten the North again. And here's the part most people don't know. The very next day, July 4th, 1863, all the way over here on the Mississippi River, the city of Vicksburg surrendered to Grant after a long, starving siege. The Union now controlled the entire river. The Confederacy was sliced clean in two, exactly like the Anaconda plan had promised. 2 crushing blows in 2 days on opposite ends of the country. The South would slowly bleed from here on out. A few months later, Lincoln stood on the Gettysburg battlefield to dedicate a cemetery and gave a speech just 2 minutes long, the Gettysburg Address. In barely 270 words, he redefined the war as a test of whether a nation built on freedom and equality could survive at all. It became the most famous speech in American history. Now it's 1864, and the North finally found the man who would end it. Lincoln put Grant in charge of every Union army, and Grant did something no other Union general had dared. He refused to retreat. He understood the brutal math better than anyone. The North had more men, more factories, and more food. If both sides just kept fighting and dying, the South would run out of soldiers first. So Grant locked on to Lee like a bulldog and never let go, hammering him through battle after bloody battle toward Richmond. The losses were horrifying, tens of thousands in weeks, and people back north started calling him a butcher. But he kept going. "Hey, your casualties are insane. The newspapers are calling for your head. I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer." And meanwhile, another Union general was about to make Georgia howl. His name was William Tecumseh Sherman, and he had a new and terrible idea about how to win. Sherman believed you didn't just have to beat the South's armies, you had to break the South's will to even keep fighting. So after capturing Atlanta in September 1864, he did something shocking. He cut himself off from his own supply lines completely and marched 60,000 men straight through the heart of Georgia, all the way to the sea, burning and eating everything in a path of destruction up to 60 miles wide. He tore up the railroads and heated the rails until they could be twisted around trees, what his men proudly called Sherman's neckties. When he reached the coast and captured the city of Savannah that December, he sent Lincoln a telegram offering the whole city as a Christmas gift. Sherman summed up his entire philosophy in 3 famous words: "War is hell." And taking Atlanta did one more thing. It saved Lincoln's job. By the summer of 1864, the North was exhausted and sick of the dying, and Lincoln looked like he might lose his re-election to a former general who wanted to negotiate a peace that left the South free. But when Atlanta fell, Northern morale soared overnight, and Lincoln won in a landslide. The war would be seen through to the end. Now the South was collapsing from every direction at once. Grant had Lee pinned in a brutal siege at Petersburg, just south of Richmond, where the two armies dug into miles of trenches for 9 grinding months, a horrifying preview of the trench warfare of World War I 50 years later. The Confederacy was starving, out of men, out of supplies, and out of time. Now it's 1865, and the end came fast. In early April, Lee's lines finally cracked at Petersburg. Richmond, the Confederate capital, fell, and Lincoln himself walked through its still burning streets while crowds of freed slaves pressed in around him just to touch him. Lee tried to run west to escape with what was left of his ragged, barefoot, starving army, hoping to link up with other forces and keep fighting somehow. But Grant's troops chased him down and got in front of him, cutting off his last escape route. Lee was surrounded, outnumbered roughly 4-1, and completely out of options. On April 9, 1865, Lee accepted that it was finally over. He sent word that he wanted to surrender, and a messenger rode ahead into a tiny nearby village to find a respectable house where the two generals could meet. In that village was Appomattox Courthouse. The messenger knocked on the door of a comfortable brick home, and the owner reluctantly agreed to host the surrender in his parlor. The owner was Wilmer McLean, the very same man whose kitchen had been blown apart at the first battle of the war 4 years earlier. He had fled 120 miles to escape it, and the war had followed him all the way here to end in his living room. Lee, in a spotless gray dress uniform, and Grant, in a muddy field coat, sat in McLean's parlor and signed the terms. Grant was deliberately generous. The Confederate soldiers could simply go home, keep their horses for the spring planting, and would not be hunted as traitors. Then, the moment it was over, Union officers swarmed the house and bought, or simply grabbed, the furniture as souvenirs, pressing cash into the protesting McLean's hands on their way out. The war was over, but the cost was almost beyond comprehension. Roughly 620,000 soldiers were dead, and modern estimates push that number as high as 750,000. That was about 2.5% of the entire American population, simply gone. Scale that to today, and it would be around 7 million Americans dead in 4 years. Disease killed twice as many men as bullets did, and 1 in 13 surviving veterans came home an amputee. But out of all that staggering death came the one thing the war had truly been about. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery forever across the whole country, freeing nearly 4 million people. The question of whether the United States was one nation or many had been answered in blood. It was one nation, and it always would be. But the peace barely lasted a week. On April 14, 1865, just 5 days after Appomattox, Abraham Lincoln went to Ford's Theater in Washington to relax and watch a play. A bitter Confederate sympathizer and actor named John Wilkes Booth slipped into the president's box and shot him in the back of the head. Lincoln died the next morning. The man who had held the country together through its darkest years and freed the enslaved would never see the nation he saved or guide it back together. And the South now faced being rebuilt without the one Northern leader who had genuinely wanted to welcome them home without vengeance. The long, bitter, unfinished work of putting the country back together, called Reconstruction, would shape America for the next 100 years. And the fight over the equality Lincoln promised is in many ways still going on today. So think back to Wilmer McLean, the grocer who just wanted to be left alone. The first major battle of the war started in his front yard, and he ran 120 miles to get away from all of it. 4 years and 600,000 dead later, the war ended in his parlor. He later put it perfectly himself. The war began in my front yard and ended in my front parlor. He spent 4 years running, and the war was always going to find him in the end. Because that's the thing about a country at war with itself. There's no village far enough away, no house quiet enough to ever truly hide from it. In those next 100 years of trying to rebuild what the war broke and finish what Lincoln started, that's a whole other story.